Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the debut album from the Mute Gods. Finally talking about it, Do Nothing Till You Hear From Me. So I'm going to start things off on a bit of a weird tangent, but I promise it will mostly make sense in context. And here it is. Am I the only one who finds the whole recommended playlist or video or album concept completely frustrating? Maybe it's just because I'm a music critic, but I like to think that the idea spreads across all forms of media. Just because I like something in one genre is no guarantee that I'm going to like something in the same genre, especially if I've got no historical record of liking them in the past. Just because I like Nightwish or Within Temptation doesn't mean that I want Evanescence recommendations, for example. And what's exasperating is that you know that it's entirely algorithm-based, off of tags and your historical viewing habits, all driven to make you consume more content. I prefer something similar to what maybe Amazon or iTunes does, which correlates albums that people buy with other purchases that they might have made. And maybe it's just me, but I would trust the taste of people over the taste of a computer trying to ascertain what I think. Now, a logical extension of that is that since people default to the lowest common denominator, that they behave in a similar way to the algorithm, but you'll find when you go into certain smaller niche subgenres like progressive rock that it isn't always the case, as people here are a little bit more willing to venture off the beaten path because they're in that niche. Now, I say all this not just because this supergroup showed up a number of times so I was looking for some new progressive rock, as you're one to do, but also because bands tend to market themselves in a similar way. Hey, we worked with these artists that you like, so maybe you should check out some of our stuff. Again, a similar sense of caution needs to be there, but I'll admit I was intrigued when I first heard about the Mute Gods. Two of the members, bassist and frontman Nick Beggs and drummer Mike Miniman, had toured with Steven Wilson and played on his excellent record from 2015, Hand Cannot Erase. When they called up Roger King to handle lead guitars, keyboards, and production, I had a reason to be enthused, but I was also kind of cautious here. I might have issues with Steven Wilson, but the man is also a musical genius as a composer and a songwriter, and I wasn't quite sure whether the stridently political approach the Mute Gods were looking to take with their debut was quite as workable as they thought it'd be. But hey, at the very least, these guys can all play incredibly well. We have evidence of that, so we're bound to get some great music out of it, right? Well, this is one of the more peculiar records that I've talked about in some time, because it is simultaneously both better and worse than I expected. On the one hand, it's definitely an album that will grow on you in terms of some surprisingly well-constructed hooks and excellent moments, but they tend to be in stark contrast to the elements that frankly should be a lot better. I'm not saying this is a bad record for a progressive rock debut. I definitely see some promise here, and a sound that knows its heritage but can move on to a unique path, but there are very real flaws that are kind of hard to overlook. In other words, it is good, it's decent, but definitely a few steps away from being truly great. So let's start out with the element that I will mostly wholeheartedly praise, the composition and the instrumentation. In contrast to Steven Wilson, the Mute Gods go for a sound that's a little bit more jagged and more willing to take risks, with nastier guitar tones and a greater risk to embrace dissonance. The most notable coming on the breakdown of Praying to a Mute God, which is actually more dissonant than I would have ever expected. And the ability to write some surprisingly sticky choruses leads to the band potentially having a stronger pop sensibility, for at least as much you would expect in progressive rock. But that's not to discount hooks like on the title track, or Last Man on Earth, or the final track Father-Daughter, or the driving central melody behind Feed the Troll that was actually really good. Hell, when this album can build some rattling presence, it can rock pretty well, like on Maverick Capello or Your Dark Ideas. Or on the flip side, it actually built some acoustic and keyboard touch spacey atmosphere like on Nightschool for Idiots or Last Man on Earth, with plenty of organ and wiry synth to add some real foundation to it. And yet, it's a shame that melodic composition is pretty much the place where any conversation of foundation will stop. Because from there we need to talk about production and where this record kind of starts to skid off the rails. Let's start with the least objectionable thing, the drums. Quite frankly, Marco Miniman is working overtime in this record with some excellently complex patterns and progressions, including a great jazzy line and strange relationship that I really liked. But it couldn't help but feel that the cymbals feel a tad overmixed compared to a deeper kick drum or a snare with a little bit more bite and texture to it. Hell, you can say that about the majority of the mid-range production, which might be able to bring out some rattling guitar presence occasionally, a little bit of bite there, but tends to blur more of the textures together, which combined with an abundance of chiptune fragments, filters, and layers of strings, it can lead to a bit of an overmixed, messy sound that doesn't really allow some great instrumentation or melodies or solos to shine through as well as they could. It's not helped by the album feeling oddly misshapen at parts, with more than a few tracks cut off before the groove can really grow or evolve, and other tracks that don't quite evolve the way they should. The most notable being the otherwise solid instrumental In the Crosshairs. It's good, but you would expect them to evolve that track a little bit more than simply the the pattern that they stick with, and that's not helped by the vocals. And while I'll give Nick Beggs some points for trying, he's not a remotely convincing frontman, I'm sorry. With backing vocals behind Steven Wilson, who he himself has been criticized in the past for not having huge range, but who can at least hold his own here, I can believe him as a backing singer, but Nick Beggs doesn't nearly have enough power or emotive range to carry these songs. I'm sorry. He can carry a tune, sure, but his willowy, thin delivery really comes across as inert and passive, except when he tries to go for a more theatrical delivery on Your Dark Ideas, and he just ends up sounding like Weird Al. And considering this is an album that's intended to be taken seriously, that's an issue. The vocal production is a real mess too, not helped by backing vocals that either seem to have more power and depth than Beggs, or are mixed in a way that they blur over each other in a really unflattering way. But nowhere is Beggs' lack of power emphasized more than on the closer Father-Daughter, a duet with his actual daughter where she actually shows some raw emotive presence and sounds pretty good. And whether it's because of mixing or just his lifeless delivery, but the song feels nowhere near as potent or emotive as it should, and that's an issue for that sort of intimate track. Now, part of this comes down to the songwriting, where the best way I can describe it is having some promise, but ultimately falling a little bit short for me. Most of this record feels reactionary and reflective on past situations, some of the dystopian world that everyone now thinks we're apparently living in, and some in a more straightforward failed relationship sense, which is perhaps the most poignant version of this coming on Last Man on Earth, probably one of my favorite songs on the album. And the odd and frustrating thing is how inconsistent so much of the nuance feels. Take Feed the Troll, which is actually pretty clever in how it targets both online trolls and those who take a sick sort of pleasure in taking them down. They're both wasting their time. But then you have songs like Nightschool for Idiots, which tries to go for poignancy and regretting a breakup that you instigated, and yet the chorus feels more gimmicky and corny than it really should. I think the bigger issue is that the nuance isn't entirely consistent, because while some of the framing highlights the impossibility of standing against the passage of time and the futility of it all, you really can't go back to fix things, it's clear we're supposed to empathize more with our protagonist, and he doesn't really display a lot of vocal personality or subtlety. More importantly, you can't help but notice that a lot of the writing doesn't really rise above passable. It's a lot of broad strokes, which is never a good sign for this sort of material. But at the end of the day, is this a good album? I think so on some level, but I'm not exactly inclined to revisit it all that much. Yes, it's definitely a grower and it has some bits of cleverness and some superb musicianship and even a few well-appreciated hooks, but at the same time, there are moments that feel limp and kind of lifeless and kind of dry than they really should. For me, it's a strong 6 out of 10, and it's kind of recommended if you're into this brand of modern progressive rock, especially if you're a fan of Steven Wilson. But otherwise, for me, it's an interesting curiosity. Nothing more, nothing less. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm going to be trying to pump out as many reviews as I can. I got a day off tomorrow, so I'm going to try to film a couple episodes. But yeah, until then, if there's anything else you want me to cover, I will try to get to it. Yes, I'll be talking about Kanye soon enough. Hold your horses there. And beyond that, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.